Hi there, my name is Sandy Christensen. I am the Deputy CFO for the City of Minneapolis. I have worked for the city for just over 2 years and I have had the opportunity to work with the city through two full budget processes. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share some of the city's budget process and decision-making opportunities with you today. Thank you for taking the opportunity to spend some time learning more about the City of Minneapolis and its budget process for 2015. I'd like to take a few minutes to explain to you the differences between public sector and private sector finances. As you're aware, the City of Minneapolis is a public entity, and in many cases you'll hear people will say often why can't the government run more like a business? And what I want to articulate to you today is that governments can't run like a business because they are very vastly different than businesses. So if you take a look at the slide that's before you right now, you'll see some of the differences between the two entities. On the private side, which would be one of your private held corporations or public corporations such as Target Industries, 3M, something along those lines, you'll see that generally they are more profit driven. They're driven by their bottom line, as opposed to the public sector, which is typically driven by outcomes or their ability to impact the public or the community. In a private sector, the customers have a choice as to whether or not they use that product or whether or not they choose to get that product from that particular business or manufacturer. In the public sector, the city or the state or the county or any of your local government is typically going to be the sole provider of a particular service. You as a homeowner don't get to choose who you buy your water from. It's going to come from the city. So the service provision is significantly different in the public sector. On the private side, the bottom line focus is on revenue. When a business is having financial difficulties, they'll typically work on increasing revenues. Whereas on the public side, the entity generally only has the ability to control its expenditures. Once it has adopted a property tax levy, it really doesn't have the ability to generate more revenue. So the public controls its budget on the expense side, whereas in the private sector, it's on the revenue side. And on the private sector, there's typically limited business lines. A business will find what it does well and continue doing that and grow their business in that manner. On the public side, the government is responsible for many, many different business lines. And we'll see more evidence of these various differences in the business lines as we go through the subsequent slides. On this slide, I've attempted to lay out some of the types of activities that are mandated to be provided by the public sector entity. So you'll see here that cities in Minnesota are required to provide certain types of activities. And I've listed them here, and they include public safety, which would be your fire services and your police department. They're also required to maintain the streets and allow for people to move around in the community, so that would be your snow plowing. We're also responsible to provide for elections, and we also do licensing and construction and permitting. And it's interesting to note that at the state level for the state of Minnesota, building and construction permitting is actually considered a public safety function because it provides for ongoing safety of the individuals that are in those infrastructures. And we also are mandated to provide sewer and water infrastructure. That doesn't mean necessarily that we have to have our own wells or that we have to necessarily have our own water treatment center. For example, the city of Minneapolis does treat water and make it available for drinking, but we do then sell water to some of the adjacent suburbs. So the city does not necessarily have to be the producer of water, but they have to make sure that it's made available to the residents. And at the same side, the sewer services need to be made available to the residents, but in most cases throughout the state of Minnesota, or at least locally through the metropolitan area, the Met Council provides that service. There's also some other opportunities in the public sector to provide programs and functions that are more optional. And some of these activities include parks and provision of parks programming, community and economic development, and libraries, although the city of Minneapolis no longer provides a library function. So there are some things that once we're done providing the mandated services, there are a number of other choices that need to be made at the local level to determine what additional amenities the residents are looking for and willing to pay for. The City of Minneapolis has an annual budget process, and I'll quickly run through that. Begins in June and August, although the departments are typically looking at some of their operational activities even as we wrap up the prior year budget. And in the upcoming year, the departments will work on their budget proposals prior to June, and through June and August, they are preparing a budget recommendation or request to the mayor's office, and they will have time at that point to sit down with the mayor and discuss any initiatives for the upcoming year. By September 30th of every year, the city's Board of Estimate and Taxation adopts a proposed levy, which becomes the maximum property taxes for the city for the upcoming year. And then from September through December, the City Council will take an opportunity to review any of the individual budgets for the separate departments and provide for presentations for each department head to speak to them about their needs for the upcoming year. Then in November, the county mails out truth and taxation notices, which incorporate the proposed property tax levies for the cities, school districts, and the county, as well as some special taxing districts. So we always like to tell people it's important when you get that piece of paper to note that the city is only responsible for the city line, the county is only responsible for the county line, and so on. And in December, the final levy is certified along with the adopted budget, and we provide that information to Hennepin County by the end of the year. And these are all handled in public meetings that residents are invited to attend and provide input. I think the one important thing to keep in mind is the annual budget process is really a series of choices. The city and its council and decision makers must ask itself, what services do we have to provide, and to what level do we need to provide them to meet our minimum requirements? What services do the taxpayers want? And what other services might we want to provide that are not mandatory? What would happen if we don't provide them? How much is it going to cost? How are we going to fund it? And do we, in making these decisions, do we raise taxes? Do we raise other revenues? Or do we cut spending in other areas to provide for funding for other activities? I'd like to take a few minutes now to do an overview of the 2015 budget so that you can see the outcome of many of the decisions that were brought forward during the 2015 budget process. So you can see in the slide before you, the City of Minneapolis overall total budget is $1.3 billion. You'll see that the Public Works Department comprises about 25% of the overall budget. It's important to also keep in mind that the Public Works Department also reflects those activities such as the provision of water and the sewer service, as well as solid waste, as well as street maintenance and so on. So the infrastructure for the city is a very, very large part of the overall budget. And if you further look in this chart, you'll see that some of the optional services, including community planning and economic development at 6% in the upper right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that many of the optional services don't actually comprise a very large portion of the budget. Much of the budget is for mandatory items. And in terms of how is the money spent, what types of things do we do within the city, the $1.3 billion budget for 2015 is in large part associated with staffing. Many of the services that we provide must be done by people, and so the salaries and benefits associated with city staff actually are the biggest piece of the overall pie. Then you'll see that contractual services, that shows up as 26% on this slide, that's for the type of activities in which we might contract out with other entities or with private sector to provide services. An example of that would be to reconstruct a road. We may choose to utilize a outside road construction business to provide that service rather than increasing our internal staffing to provide that when we know that over time that there may be greater or lesser need in any one given year. How do we pay for that budget? The $1.3 billion budget for 2015 comes from a number of sources. You'll see that the two largest pieces of the pie in terms of funding come from property taxes at 21%, and the charges and sales for services at 38%. And it's important also to note that within the charges and sales for services are also all of the fees that are associated with having water, your sewer bill, your garbage pickup bill, all of those are charges for services. So They are typically still going to be paid by an individual property owner, but it's going to be based upon the volume of the service that they use. And as you look through the other areas within the overall budget funding, you'll see that local government aid, which is an aid that the city receives from the state of Minnesota, is about 6%. And we receive other funding from the federal government as well as from the other local governments, including Hennepin County. In terms of the overall budget, the majority of the mandatory services provided by the city are encompassed in the city's general fund. And that kind of makes sense because they're the general governmental services. But in the chart in front of you, you'll see that the general fund, or the mandatory services, the general services, are about 31% of the city's overall budget. And going a little bit more detail into what the general fund budget includes, you can see that the largest piece of the pie here in the governmental services is the police department at approximately 1/3 of the city's overall budget. At the same time, the fire department comprises about 13%, and public works, in terms of regular street maintenance and plowing and so forth, is about 12%. Where does the money in the general fund come from? As the chart in front of you shows, the majority of the funding comes from property taxes. You'll see that 34% of the city's overall general fund budget is funded through property taxes, which we think makes sense because if these are general operational expenditures or things that we need to do just as a basic level of service, it makes sense to use one of the most general sources of revenues, which are the property taxes. One could not specifically state that you are buying one linear foot worth of snow plowing, so it would be hard to pay for it in any other way than a revenue source that crosses all boundaries within the city. You'll also see that the local government aid at 17% is also a significant piece of the city's overall general fund budget. And again, that makes sense as well because the state provides that funding to provide basic services within the community. So as you look through, you can see that there's really a vast variety of resources, but in general, the two most flexible, broad-based revenue sources provide the majority of the funding in the general fund. Over time, the property taxes within the city of Minneapolis have fluctuated. During some of the tough economic years, the city was required to have some levy increases between 2009 and 2011. And having asked the residents to give more during tough economic times, the city council and mayor were able to hold the levy flat in 2012. There was a modest increase in 2013, but again, due to growth in the local economy, the city was very pleased to be able to come back in 2014 with a 1% levy reduction, reducing the property taxes from $284.6 million to $281.7 million. There's a modest increase for 2015 of 2.1%, bringing the city's overall property tax levy to $287.6 million. And it's interesting to note as we started off this presentation that the city's overall budget is about $1.3 billion, and we're able to provide for that budget with a property tax levy of less than $300 million or less than 25%. This rather busy chart in front of you shows the multiple obligations that the city has to take into consideration when choosing a property tax levy amount. You'll see that we provide property tax funding for our city's general fund. We noted that earlier. The city is also responsible for levying for the Minneapolis Park Board. We've got a levy for the general operations as well as for tree replacement. The line item referred to as bond redemption levy reflects the amount of property taxes and resources that we need to pay off outstanding loans. And there are a number of other smaller levies that you'll see that remain relatively flat over time. In general, the 2015 budget is a $5.9 million increase over the prior year. So if you're a resident in the city of Minneapolis and you have the average valued home at $201,250, how are your property tax dollars going to be used? Remember, when you receive your property tax statement, you're receiving a statement that reflects all of the jurisdictions. You've got the county, the school district, the city, mosquito control and regional rail and some other areas within Hennepin County. If you have that average home, you're likely to receive a property tax bill for 2015 of about $1,259. So if we consider how those property taxes are dispersed throughout all of the functions that we've been discussing, you'll see that in 2015, about $290 of your property taxes will go towards paying for parks, about $227 for the police, and about $101 for fire, $63 to have your streets plowed, and a modest amount for the libraries. And again, it's important to note in the far right column that if one were to look at what you will pay on a monthly basis for a number of these services, you'll see that it's very unlikely that you would find a private business willing to provide them for the amount that you're paying through your property taxes. And again, I think it's important to articulate that Minneapolis is just one of the agencies to which a Minneapolis homeowner pays property taxes. The city of Minneapolis on your tax bill is about 43%. And with that, I look forward to having a discussion with you on February 21st, and I appreciate your time.